Hello? Okay. Last night, I was a bit dispirited. I had an extreme stomach ache. I didn't mention it because the filmmaker, I once had a telephone call with a filmmaker, Harry Smith, one of whose his work will be shown tomorrow. He's quite interesting and a bit mad. And he said, "How are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm feeling terrible." He said, "Don't say it!" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Germs love publicity." He says, "If you don't, they go away otherwise." So I tried it last night, and I think they're beaten. But if there was a dispirited quality in my discourse, it was due more to my ailment than anything else. Today, I want to address myself to the question of narrative and the question of the interesting word autor, author, and the sense of authority that stories have. And one finds in Wittgenstein, in the later work, in the Philosophische Bemerkungen, a little parenthesis that isn't too innocent. I may even be spelling it wrong. Just that. It may be misspelled, but it's Grammatik als Theologie. One might speculate that he was referring back to one of the more cogent observations of the late Nietzsche, who said, as long as we have grammar, we'll always have God around. In my own perverse and temporary misreading of that statement, I want to propose the notion that as long as we have what is called narrative, we have God, or some negative version of God, or maybe even that terrible, strange God the Greeks called tike, chance, a vicious God. In any case, my discourse tonight will be about the relationship of the author, the fictional author of a story, to God. And I had originally proposed to show 6 excerpts from a film called Ménilmontant. Now, Ménilmontant happens to be a half an hour long, and I figured out that showing 6 excerpts would take twice as long as showing the whole Ménilmontant. Since it's so short, I'm going to show the entire film first before discussing it. And then I will go on to discuss Bresson and his film Pickpocket, and finally Dreyer and his film Audit. There are some papers which have been distributed that contain a few quotations from Dreyer, one quotation from Dreyer and a few little passages from Bresson, and I'll be alluding to those texts in my discourse. Let's see, Ménilmontant. It's not my intention to go into the historical nature of narrative. That is, to outline, as has been quite adequately done in the interesting histories of the novel, the relationship of the novel and story to the rise of Protestant culture and the breakdown of a certain theological background. It's there. But we can reduce ourselves to one fundamental principle, and that is, in narrative, in most narrative, a person is what happened to him. He's identical to his story. One presents David Copperfield or Ahab or Ivan Karamazov, and who is he? He is the person to whom these things have happened. And when we know enough about the things that have happened, we know who he is. In the more banal versions that we can find in movies, movies are very good for banal versions, like we get Citizen Kane and his stupid little rosebud. That's a who is he search story. Kirsanov's film that you've just seen is a brilliant mixture of radical figuration and conventional mimesis. By that I mean he has taken the conventions of D.W. Griffith very largely, that habits of D.W. Griffith. One of Griffith's principles, when you want to show a woman acting innocently, put a bow in her hair and have her jump up and down. And if you want to create a more touching scene, make sure you throw a baby in or a furry animal. On the other hand, and this film is a very good mimetic film. I mean, I am moved when I see her cry, when I see her desire that bread and not know how to thank for it. Yet I'm more moved by the radical figuration, by the way in which figures of cinema are used to move the story along. For instance, that marvelous figure, that proleptic figure early in the film, the parents are dead. We see the graves, and suddenly the sisters are no longer at the graves, and we see grass growing. And then the grass is very high, and then the grave is broken, and then there's just mud. In other words, in a series of figures, the fact has been brought home that not only are they going away from this family grave, but they will never return again. This is expressed through that proleptic figure of the ultimate disregard of the grave. Or the figurative way in which they arrive in Paris. We see them along the road, and this is not just a departure, it is an archetypical departure. That is, the uniquely cinematic way of expressing it is to have a series of dissolves along that road, making it a more essential departure. And then, splendid figure. Suddenly, the camera is handheld. Suddenly, we are in the world and spirit of Paris. And we have the feeling of what it would be like, perhaps, for these two country girls to see Paris for the first time. Yet this is a tricky figure, because although we experience it that way, as the representation of their subjective impression of Paris for the first time, in the course of that sequence, we come to learn that they are already installed in Paris. They already have a job, and this happens to represent noon lunch break. They're obviously working on the morning shift, and home they go. This figure in rhetoric would be called solipsis. It starts one way and it ends another. And this has to do with Kirsanov's authority. From the very beginning of this film, Kirsanov, now let me take back Kirsanov, because I don't want to confuse the auteur or the author of a film with the man who made the film. By every fiction presupposes an author. Every fiction presupposes an author who isn't necessarily Count Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Melville. It is some being who knows the events and is telling them to you, is providing you with what information you need to know. Sometimes it's an agnostic author. Sometimes he says, all I know about this situation is this. I'm telling you everything I know. Or I heard this story on a train somewhere. Kirsanov is not at all an agnostic author, or the author of Menil-Montant is not at all agnostic. He demonstrates to us instantly and with tremendous cinematic felicity his control over the situation and the superabundance of the knowledge that he has vis-a-vis what he will give us. For there is this axe murder about which we know nothing except that it is an axe murder. And the style of the film is telling us you need know nothing more about it. Not that I know, I the author know nothing about it, but you need know nothing more. Here it is. Here is this event. It begins my story, and I give you what you need to know. And likewise in that soliptic figure of arriving in Paris, at which the viewer is led to interpret it one way first, and then discovers that he has at least temporarily misinterpreted it. Kirsanov is asserting, or the author is asserting, his cinematic authority or control over the materials. We must run behind with our interpretive mechanism to follow this question. The figures of ambiguity are very large in here. Menil-Montant is a district in Paris, that medieval district that one sees in the film. It's behind Père Lachaise, and it's a working class quarter. has been for a long time and still is. And one of the ways in which cinema chooses to tell stories, its primary means, is not by telling, not by quoting. The novel is very fond of the expression, he said, and then someone says something. And she said, oh, people are do an awful lot of saying in novels. Scenes bring them together and they say. In films, in narrative films, they do a tremendous amount of looking. The nature of the whole conventions of montage have derived around the idea that someone looks in one direction and then we get a shot of what they see. Kirsanov, of course, presupposes this logic of film and continually violates it, shifts it, exerts his authority over it. And one of the ways in which that's most effective is on the streets of Menilmontant, when the young man has apparently seduced both sisters, and we see him come out of a wine shop and come up the street in one direction, hesitate, go down in another, and then we see him in the maze of streets, walk in one direction, signal in the other, disappear, and come back in that direction with the heavier of the two sisters. The very ambiguity of the streets is a figure of the ambiguity of our sense of whether or not the angle is the angle from which someone is looking, or whether or not the direction in which he is looking is the one in which we are operating. Consider that first dramatic moment at which the heroine is presented to us. We see her looking at what we do not see. We see a crowd of people standing in a semicircle, obviously defining the corpse with their eyes below them, and we see her face. She has seen it. And in a dramatic cinematic figure, the camera moves closer and closer and closer and closer in a series of halting movements. So the look plays a crucial role there. And at the point at which she realizes that her sister has been seduced, is about to be seduced, is being seduced by this same man, again the camera comes in with that same halting moment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shots right into her face. Nowhere else in the film does this occur. What Kirsanov is claiming here is that not only is she a figure to whom this dramatic event happened, this formative event in her childhood that made her part of what she is, but that the traumatic nature of that event is re-experienced in the betrayal of her by her sister and her lover. So that the formal cinematic technique of representing this moment of shock, when it occurs only twice in the cinematic context, necessarily relates the two events. It creates a formal structure which reinforces the sense, the fundamental narrative principle that a person is what happened to him. We see it happening, and we see the form of it happening again in the same way. Now, this is a film without intertitles, without subtitles. Kirsanov was very proud of that. There were many films in the 20s made without titles, and there was a long theoretical discussion. Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera is subtitled a film without subtitles. Lupu Pick made a few films of that sort. Murnau did. The desire was to prove the uniqueness of cinematic expression in such works. The repetition of figures is very interesting in this film because we have that first experience of Paris, the whirling life of Paris, which of course, cloistered in Menilmontant, they know nothing about. So the first night that the sister spends alone, the younger sister, or the more beautiful sister spends alone, we see the other sister alone in bed, and we see what she hears, the footsteps outside as she awaits her sister. And then suddenly in superimposition comes again that whirling, handheld view of Paris, that first experience of Paris, the Paris which is not theirs. This might not be mine, so Paris which is not theirs. And superimposed on top of that is the nude body of her sister. So in her jealous fantasy, she is imagining, she has an erotic fantasy of her sister participating in this Paris that they first experienced as the release from their early tragedy. So that handheld camera movement links the two scenes. Costume can link it too. For at the point at which the sister first comes away from her lover in her depression, she looks upon the Seine and she contemplates suicide. Just before that suicidal contemplation, she pictures her own lost innocence. That is, we see her again dressed in that same costume with that same bow as we saw her at the beginning of the film. and we see her innocent and happy. But the very nature of the costume and the nature of that recollection is such that we cannot see that image without having linked to it the image of the tragic death of her parents. So through costume at this particular point, the repetition reinforces itself in cinematic terms. That image of the whirling city in Paris recurs again when she comes out of the maternity ward. Now it is an exceptionally hostile, rainy Paris that has no place for her. And passing over in front of us are hearses, closing her out. And finally, at the end of the film, after she's been fed, we see again the whirling nightlights of Paris. We see bal, a dance hall. We see hotels. And the seamier aspect of that nightlife, prostitution, suddenly manifests itself in that same figure. And as she's becoming reconciled with the sister by a sudden act of chance, in that curious maze of streets, that scene is witnessed by their lover, this gang character. And because he has suddenly witnessed that scene, he stops. And because he stops, he is killed. He is killed by a prostitute and someone else for reasons that we know no more about than we knew about the initial murder at the beginning of the story. And so we see at the very end, through a figure called synecdoche, that is the part for the whole, the making of these boutons, and we know that the sisters are back in their factory. Here we have it. What's the story of these two girls who work in the bouton factory? Oh, let me tell you. They had this terrible thing that happened when they were children. They got seduced, they had a child, and etc. They are, within the conventions of narrative, what has happened to them. It is part of Kirsanov's structure to reinforce the nature of memory, the nature of history, the nature of these patternings by cinematic repetitions of certain dramatic figures, so that even though the content changes, we need not flash back. There's no flashback ever on the death of the parents. The closest we come to it is the flashback on the parents' house. We see the sister sitting on the park bench, and she thinks of the fire. Right after the parents' death, there's an image of the fire in the fireplace, and she thinks of the fire that was warming her in that house. And she thinks of the table set for many guests and when she has no food, and she thinks of the running water. Those are, that illusion, that linking illusion of the fire is the only thing that brings us back to this, the closest we get to a recall, a flashback sequence, yet the entire film is structured formally in terms of the perpetual recurrence and reformative nature of the cumulative events that have happened to them. Repetition, of course, is the figure, is the formal device, which is the structure of memory. And memory is the crucial reinforcement of the authority which determines character and narrative. One wouldn't be what happened to one if one could ultimately forget. Now, there are stories of forgetfulness, by the way, have nothing to do with this. There are many stories about people who lose their memory, but these stories only prove the point, because ultimately in those stories, some event occurs, something from the past recurs, which forces some giant confrontation, and sometimes even a regaining of memory. No. Traditional narrative is dependent upon the fiction of authority, and as it rises in a non-theological context, the god TK, or chance, takes more and more force. What chanced to happen is what made these particular girls what they are. But I want to turn from this theology to a very different one, to the cinema of Robert Bresson, who is a Jansenist and who shares with Jansonian Catholicism a wild antinomian streak. Now, of course, if one is familiar with antinomian theology, antinomian theology is a particularly interesting perversion of Protestantism, which claims that we are redeemed or lost. What we do cannot be judged by other men. The greatest poet of antinomian philosophy, as far as I know, is Milton. That man is not what happened to him. He is made in some fundamental way, and that perhaps he can be opened up to what he is. Bresson's film Pickpocket is very interesting in this case. It is a unconscious, I believe, unconsciously derived from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Bresson has refused to acknowledge this derivation, although he has made two other films based on Dostoevsky's text, and it's quite clear that Michel's obsession with proving that he can commit a crime because he is a superior man is Dostoevskian, and the ultimate relationship that he determines with a woman through this crime is Dostoevskian. Let me show you first of all the opening sequence of this film, because the nature of its narrative authority is so different than that of Kirsanov's. Well, here the case is clear. The author is one Michel. From the very beginning of this film, the author names himself. This film is to be a journal or a diary or an autobiography. We see the hand writing the text. We will know as much about this man as he cares to tell you about himself. This is his own story. There will be no shot in this film that shows something going on outside of his own realm of consciousness. We don't see the police station, meanwhile, tracking him down. We don't see people conversing about him when he's not there. It is from Michel's own point of view that this story is written. At the very beginning, there's a rubric of the film before the titles saying this isn't a police story. This isn't a cops and robbers story. It is the nightmare of a young man, etc. The cauchemar. Bresson has been criticized by those who don't admire his style for the woodenness of his actors, for the deadpan quality by which they refuse to play dramatic roles. He deliberately chooses amateurs, of course, to play all of these parts. Bresson's concern is consistently theoretical. And the word cauchemar or nightmare is very interesting because Bresson, although he has often made films in the first person, has never decided to use the camera as if it were a character, as if it were eyes. One of the most hilarious examples of the failure of this principle is a film by Robert Montgomery called Lady in the Lake. It's a Raymond Chandler story. And the camera plays a detective. And this heavy Hollywood Mitchell goes wandering around through scenes. It gets drunk and staggers. It gets a punch in the lens at one particular point. Only at one moment does Robert Montgomery show up. Someone shouts into the camera, look at yourself, you're a sight. And the camera suddenly turns into a mirror. And there's Robert Montgomery with a big shiner. And one of the things which is fundamentally strange about this, and Eisenstein indirectly points it up, although not talking about Lady in the Lake, is that we can visually identify with the camera. And Brakhage creates a first-person cinema in which we identify with the sights. Yet, when I look out at you, I see you. I see my vision of you. But when I speak, I do not hear my voice with the same sense, with the same exteriority that I see a sight when I suddenly open my eyes. I know what I'm going to say, hopefully, a little before I say it. I hear my voice interiorly. There's something incredibly perverse about seeing this camera and hearing someone else speak for us in Robert Montgomery's Lady in the Lake and in all of those Hollywood films that have attempted to be first-person films. It's that schizophrenic breakdown of the central nervous system where optics are receptive, but vocalization is interior, yet they both come as receptive. Eisenstein said at the beginning of the sound period, wanting to make a subjectivist film from inside someone's mind, actually a treatment of an American tragedy by Dreiser, said, obviously, the true subject for sound film is interior monologue. Bresson says cauchemar, nightmare. Of course, in our nightmares or in our dreams is one of the places, or in our memories, One of the places where we don't see with our eyes only, but we can see ourselves represented. A kind of static stand-in figure who doesn't surprise us, who comes with the same kind of expected quality that our voice comes from inside. And Bresson has quite deliberately and intelligently treated this journal film as a first-person film in that retrospective glance. It's the self's relationship to the self in memory and in reconstruction. And for the self to have a relationship to the self, there is one fundamental mediating category, and that is writing. One of the ways in which the self solidifies itself is by naming itself, I. I is a generalized name, communal name for the self. It unifies temporarily and fictionally a whole mass of complicated prehensions and apperceptions. So Bresson very carefully establishes the textuality of the film. The hand writes, and the voice-over repeats what the hand is writing, reinforcing voice, writing, and textual tradition. Yet the text itself, from the very beginning, puts itself into question. It says, paradoxically, there are two kinds of people. There are those who do things, and there are those who write about things. I, however, have done what I've written about. Let us be suspicious. From the very beginning, this film puts its mode of representation into question, and then gives us a fine cinematic demonstration of the synthetic way in which we apprehend space in sound film. We see a man standing and a group of other people standing, looking quite deadpan out at us, and we hear the spatialization of a racetrack scene. So together, we put together the image of some people staring at the camera and the sound of racetracks as the representation of a racetrack. It is done synthetically by us in this very first scene. Likewise, emotional qualities are linguistic. As he flips the latch on a woman's purse, he tells us how nervous he is. So from this very beginning, there is that rupture, that gap established between feeling and seeing. Seeing, hearing, feeling, writing, naming. All established quite specifically in the opening sequence of this film. Now the story is such that Michel is picked up by the police, but they can't pin anything on him. So he has proven his principle. He has robbed once to prove he is a superior man. And so, according to the narrative of the film, would give up robbing were it not for something. One day on the subway, he sees someone reading a newspaper, coming close to another person and folding the newspaper like that. Having experienced theft, he knows what is going on. In other words, he is someone who, because of some act of his own, has transformed his mode of seeing the world. So this act of reading a newspaper and coming close to the other man is meaningful to him in a way it isn't to other people. He knows that this is a device for picking pockets. And so in imitation, mimesis comes over. Bresson, who is the enemy of cinematic representation, through imitation shows us the story of imitation. Michel decides to imitate this act. And so, fearfully, he does so. And gradually, he becomes an autodidact. What we have is the Bildung of a pickpocket. And in the course of this education in theft, of exchange, there is not only the self-education, but the moment comes of the socialization and the sexualization of this education. Because suddenly, there is a man prowling in front of his apartment, and he eyes him one way and the other, and the scene looks like nothing so much as a homosexual pickup. And finally, in the course of their eyeing one another back and forth in Paris for a couple of days, the liaison is made. The contact is made possible, and he is being initiated into a group of pickpockets in a socialized form. His true education is taking place. And in what is the most spectacular scene in the film, we see the elaborate exchange of camera movements and an orgy of theft in the Gare de Lyon. This is a sequence, I believe, which those of you who know Renoir's cinema might recognize its origins. In the middle of La Règle de Jure, there is a hunt sequence of fantastic proportions in which the assembled bourgeoisie hunt both birds and rabbits. And the montage of the coordinations between the movements of the rabbits, the movements of the beaters, the sighting of the shooters, the shooting, the killing of the rabbits, the killing of the birds, by this collective mechanism is one of the most dazzling moments in the history of sound montage. Bresson has made his own film of exchange. Before showing you that passage, I would like to call your attention to a... this is amusing. I spent a good part of today trying to figure out why I possibly put one of the 4 quotations from Bresson on this page, and I failed. The one that in French begins prodigieuse machin tombé du ciel is a mystery to me. But the first one I have on my page is the one in which he talks about Proust and Dostoevsky, in which he emphasizes that what Proust says is most original in Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky must be Bresson's most important author, is composition. It's an extraordinarily complex ensemble with internal currents like the sea. And if there is a sequence of complexity in all of Bresson, Bresson's sense of internal complexity and internal rhythm, it is the sequence we are about to see in the Gare de Lyon. A tour de force of... after seeing that sequence, I have never been comfortable in a train station. Look like that. But here, Bresson, I mean, that when one analyzes this shot by shot, and I've done so, the elaborate choreography is spectacular because there's an immense economy of shots. Bresson is very fond of showing what can be done with a single shot. He does not like very much the movement from long shot to close-up, but likes to arrange his cinematic choreography in such a way that a panning shot can suddenly pick up on a detail and then shift 2 or 3 times. And in this sequence, he does it with spectacular effect, so that there is established a sense of the cinematic tour de force coming to terms with the criminal tour de force that's at stake at that very same moment. This, by the way, is not at all unusual in the higher tradition of crime films. That is, when one looks back at things like Lang's Dr. Mabuse, the more elaborate schemes of Mabuse are expressed in the most elaborate forms of cinematic montage. This just seems to have been one particular area of the minor elaboration of the cinematic imagination. Bresson, in another one of his gnomic texts from his notes on cinematography, comments upon the things which can be expressed with the hand, with the head, and the shoulders, and of the urge for economy. But at the very end of Bresson's book, he has one passage that I want to emphasize. He says, divination. It's translated there. Divination. This word. And then he asks, how can I not associate it with the 2 sublime machines which I have to work with? And then he says, praise to the camera and to the tape recorder. He says, camera and tape recorder, take me far away, loin de l'intelligence qui complique tout. Take me far away from the intelligence which complicates everything. One has to put this next to the praise of Dostoevsky in terms of of being extraordinairement complex. The divination of cinema, camera, tape recorder, as divining instruments, are those which take me far away from the intelligence which complicates everything. This is the high point of the education of the pickpocket, as he says. This cannot go on. There's no point beyond which he can go. He has learned to look at the world in such a way as to notice the way people use and have money. He can respond to it in a complicated, articulated language of exchanging people's wallets, taking the money out, withdrawing, theft. Yet there is something else. So I move now to the very end of the film, which takes us almost exactly back to the opening scene, and then the coda, where everything matters very much. So we find Michel again in that same situation, staring out at the racetrack, about to make another theft, and he reads and reads correctly. He looks into the eyes of the detective behind him, and he says, "I saw malice in his eyes." He's still reading in that context. Remember, he's the man who read Barrington, the British thief, in order to educate himself in the world of theft. And although he reads malice, he is tricked. And next moment we find him in jail. But in jail, we are struck, we have to be struck by the exact similarity of that cell to the room he was living in all the time. In fact, it's quite ambiguous in that first shot whether he's really in jail or not. But he is in jail, he's behind the bars, and he tells us in true antinomian form, "I do not even see the bars." There can't be any more antinomian statement than that. This is the kind of text one finds in many religious texts of the 16th, 17th century, texts of imprisoned religion. I do not see the worldly situation, it is only my relationship with God. Here, of course, it isn't the relationship with God Michel is talking about. The only thing he says is the idea of his superiority. But he does not see the world. And he insists on telling Jean how little he needs her. And he goes back to the cell and she doesn't come. And then comes a letter. In the act of reading this letter, which is not read voiceover because it is the letter of the other, the writing of someone else, suddenly in the act of reading this letter, which has nothing interesting in it except for a statement that the kid was sick and she couldn't come, he says, "Suddenly my heart beat very fast." Again, that emotional description, very much like at the opening of the film. And in the final sequence, then, he comes out and he says the most important line in the film, which cannot be translated. Quelque chose illumina sa figure. The word in French is adequately translated for a normal movie as a Gesicht is it? Face. Your face. Something illuminated her face. But a figure is not only a face, it is a figure, a figura, a word with one of the most powerful histories in our entire literary heritage. One doesn't even have to work it out. Eric Auerbach, in one of his best essays, worked out the history of the word figure, figura. One of its early meanings is in rhetoric. One speaks of figures of speech, rhetorical figures, the ways in which what is literal can be taken figuratively, the instability of any statement in front of interpretation. And of course, in the great biblical hermeneutic tradition, the entire Old Testament is taken as figures for the New Testament. It is the figurative reading. And that same reading of all of history as a figure of the New and Old Testament, a word heavily imbued with theological terms. He says something, quelque chose illumina sa figure. Something lit up her figure. Literally, of course, we know what lit up her figure. light from the spotlight. We see it. Something lit up her figure. Suddenly he sees in her something other than what he has been seeing before. He wasn't even seeing the cell. He was seeing in the past where money went and how to slip it out of wallets. And suddenly at this point, he sees figuratively. He doesn't see literally. He sees her figure lit up, and everything has changed. The entire story is meaningless. It only leads up to the negative moment. The entire film exists for that one moment at which something could illuminate that figure. Some act of divination would occur that would call forth Lully's music at that moment and bring the film to an end. Of course, the implication is for us viewers that we too are faced with the choice of literally putting together a series of pictures into a montage and making a figurative logic out of it, or literally putting together picture and sound, or else allowing those instruments to illuminate figuratively. Here we have in Bresson's work a great antinomian narrative about the very instability of narrative itself, told many ways, told in the opening parable of the story, told again in the paradox of the story, told again in the process of imitation throughout the film, and finally told in those elaborate and carefully written sequences at the end where his sight changes and everything changes at that point. Which brings me on the scale of elevation and sublimity to the great master of all, to Dreyer. We don't have Dreyer's Gertrude here, otherwise I would show you the final scene of it. Dreyer was very interested in the adaptation of theater. At a time when film theoreticians were running away from theater, saying what is really cinematic is not being theater, that you can show the Russian army over here and the French army over here, and you cut to Napoleon over there, and we can do this in fast montage and not just be stuck like the theater. Dreyer said no. No, cinema is simply purer than theater. Cinema must pare down from theater. In Dreyer's first essay on the sound film in 1933, he gives an example. Did I lose it? No. He gives an example of what would be good theater. He has just seen a play called Ordet, The Word. And he's thinking about, in 1933, he's thinking about what it would be like to film this play. This play, by the way, when Dreyer saw it, was written by a young priest in his 20s, a young minister. If The Word were to be filmed, he said, all the scenes in the sick room, which the theater audience gets to know only through conversation, would have to be included in the film. The actors going to and from the sickbed would contribute to creating the two types of restlessness or excitement that condition the rhythm of the film to an essential degree. This is referring to an earlier part of the essay where he's developing a notion of the rhythms of restlessness and excitement as essentially cinematic rhythms. This addition of many new scenes demands a very strong compression of the dialogue. That is, for everything you add, you take away. But it's amazing how one can keep stripping the dialogue of entire speeches, sentences, words, without any other effect than that the writer's thoughts stand out even more clearly. The talking film presents itself, he underlines, like a theater piece in concentrated form. For this reason, it is important that the poetic idea appear with the greatest possible clarity, even if it must be done at the expense of one nuance or another. For while the spectator in a theater always has time to place to recollect, i.e. to compare the remarks that are being said with the previously mentioned information, the film is flickering away so quickly on the screen that the audience cannot possibly manage to pay attention to lines that don't have present value, i.e. are not absolutely connected with the situation that exists at the moment. Besides, there is often a possibility of visualizing parts of the dialogue, and here the close-up picture, which renders the smallest changes of expression, comes in very handy. Finally, in producing the manuscript, one should aim at unity of time and place, as opposed to the inclusion of the most times and places, with the purpose of gathering all the bound-up tension of the material around the central idea. The real talking film must not be photographed theater. This gathering up of tension is Dreyer's great genius. In Gertrude, he took a play by Söderberg, not a bad play, a play about a very interesting woman, describing two of her previous lovers. Her husband's a minister, a state minister, and the national poet is a former lover of hers. The national poet has come to town, and he wonders why she ever left him, and she's having an affair with a young, upcoming avant-garde pianist who does nothing but brag about his relationship with her. So she's involved with these various men, and she's and to give her his book based on their Paris experiences. Not a personal book, a book on Racine. So Dreyer adds this scene. The old man comes back, she gives him the letters, he takes the letters and burns them in the fire. And he asks her a question. He says, why didn't you ever write a poem? And she says, I did write a poem once. And the poem, she tells him, was in fact in the original play as an incidental scene when she's talking with the poet in the amphitheater of a banquet hall. And she says, oh, I wrote this poem when I was 16, and she quotes it. But now Dreyer takes that one poem, seizes upon this one text, and as he says here, underlines it, outlines it, makes it appear with the greatest possible clarity, makes the writer's thought stand out even more clearly. He isolates this poem. The poem in English says, look at me. I'm not beautiful, yet I've loved. Look at me. I'm not young, yet I have loved. Look at me. I do not live, yet I have loved. One must flash back in time for a moment to the opening of the Phenomenology of the Spirit by Hegel. And in the beginning of in the first chapter of the Phenomenology, he gives the parable of the text, of the written text. Hegel says, the here and now, the jetzt und the here, doesn't really exist. Because I can sit at my desk and I can write, here I am at my desk, it is 9 o'clock. And if I come back 6 hours later, the text is no longer true. If I take the text with me, the text is no longer true. That in terms of immediate sensibility, there is no textual truth. Now here's Gertrude. At 16 years old, she must have been a knockout because she was quite a beauty. At 60, she says to 60 more years, 65 more years maybe later, look at me, I am not beautiful. Well, in a way, she is not any longer beautiful. The text is true, but I have loved. I am not, but have loved. So the text becomes, I am not young, quite true, but have loved. And then that final line takes on a particular Dreyer-esque radiance. I do not live. And in this moment, Dreyer brings us as close as cinema can to the one thing he finds worth narrating, the one thing he finds worth telling, death. Dreyer's cinema tells us death, names it again and again. If one goes back to the earliest scenes in Dreyer, the greatest scenes are the scenes of death, someone dying. Fabulous, wonderful scenes of death. Dreyer brings cinema to that blank space where images can't penetrate and films from there. And Gertrude is telling us, just before she says goodbye, and we last see her waving away, says, I do not live. It's that act of the voice at that very moment, that very threshold of light in cinema where death comes into play. And all through Gertrude, we see the characters staring not at each other, not coordinating the elements of the shots through the stare, as so many films do, but staring off, talking to each other and looking always off, and looking as though they do not focus on any wall, looking through whatever wall or stage there is, not looking at the camera, but looking off into some blank, imageless space. Death. And the great poem of death, the triumphal poem of death in Dreyer's work, is called Ordit, and I know of no greater achievement on film, and few that human beings have ever achieved. But to speak of it first, I must describe another death, because it was very, very important. Dreyer got interested in Ordit in 1933. He made it in 1955. Ordit was written by this young minister, Munch. And, you know, there's a kind of myth that Dreyer takes bad plays and makes greater films out of them. It's not true. Dreyer has exceptionally good taste in plays, but it's rather conventional taste. And the plays he has adapted are quite good. Ordit is more than good. It is an excellent play. It is a first-class play. Dreyer has made a couple of little changes in it, which I'll get to. But between the time Dreyer got interested in that play and the time he made it, something very important happened. Munch was a young minister in Jutland, which is a primitive country part of Denmark. And he had a parish at the time of the German takeover of Denmark. And an edict was passed intensifying censorship in Denmark. Anti-resistance edict. And Munch gave what became one of the most famous sermons ever given in that country. He, in a little Jutland church, he made a sermon which was then published and passed all around Denmark until it was finally repressed. On the text, the biblical text, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto me what is mine. And his sermon went something as follows. He says that we are a conquered nation, and by all the rules of conquest, we owe our children to our conquerors. So our young men will go, and they will fight for Germany, and they will fight loyally, and they will die loyally. And this we must do as conquered people. Yet, if we are to say that we are fighting in the name of justice, if we are to think as we die that it is for a good cause, then this goes deeply against any principle that we've learned from the Bible. This is what Jesus meant when he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We go to die for you. But render unto me what is mine. That is our minds. The Gestapo killed him that week. He became a national hero. When Dreyer returned, and part of that national heroism is reflected in a Swedish production of the film. It had political overtones. It's kind of neutralist political overtones to do anything of Kai Munch after that. So when Dreyer went back in 1955 to make Ordit, he was dealing with a national hero of great proportion. He was creating a work that in time had taken on very strong reverberations. He went to Jutland and got the permission of Munch's wife, and got many people who knew Munch and bought entire farms and had them moved to the studio. He even had an entire farm floor purchased to be laid underneath a rug because he didn't like the way the light would reflect. He wanted such perfection of atmosphere. Dreyer is above all a realist, a fanatic, mad realist. He took a few things out of the film, out of the play. In the play, there's an early sequence in which Johannes is first seen behaving madly, and his father speaks to the new minister and tells him about Johannes. No, the older brother tells him about Johannes, and the older brother says, it's a very sad story, but he went to a play about resurrection. And at that play, he was so moved. He was a young theology student, and he was with his girlfriend. They were about to get married. And he was so moved that he walked out in a daze, and he stepped right in front of a truck. And his girlfriend pushed him with all of her might, threw him onto the ground, saved him from the truck, but the truck hit and killed her. And from that moment on, Johannes was mad. Well, Dreyer removed that act of causality from the play. And simply as one illusion, he went mad studying the theologians, Kierkegaard and the other theologians, which always appears as a retrospective joke, because we know the pseudonymous Kierkegaard, not the standard theologian Kierkegaard, or the standard theological works of Kierkegaard. But Dreyer removes that causality. There's another thing. The doctor has one mad campaign on. He hates the fact, he's constantly attacking the priest in the fact that priests can write death certificates. And he's talking about inaccurate causes of death certificates. So at the point of resurrection, in the play, the doctor says, see, what did I tell you about those bad death certificates? Casting the entire miracle into a penumbra, somewhat like Bergman's Virgin Spring. It could be, it couldn't be. Dreyer would have none of that either. Dreyer stripped down those two acts of ambiguity. Now, I want to show you what Dreyer did in the sequence that he wrote about when he came to film the sequence of Inger in labor, which would only be referred to off-screen otherwise. Say it's the most brutal scene I've ever seen in a film. Not in the bad sense. I mean, when Dreyer talks about, imagine him meditating for 22 years on how he was going to do that scene. You noticed, I hope, that the camera moved in every single shot. The camera moves in almost every shot. The camera does not stop moving until Inger dies when you get one shot, one close-up of her face. There's not a single shot in this film that doesn't involve a major readjustment of the camera. Even when we saw her upside down, lying on the bed. Now, that's a shot from which you can go nowhere. Dreyer nevertheless cranes up and gets the image of Mikkel holding her hand, and then moves over. It's elaborate choreography of the camera. And the reason for it is to reinforce the realism throughout this film. That montage is doing almost no work in this early part, until the very end of this film. It's that continual replacement of the camera within those rooms, which gives an intensified feeling to the reality of those spaces, to the existence of those spaces. This is a film whose cinematic technique all along is to convince us of the starkest and most immediate realism. It even begins with a curious foil. In the first part of the film, we think that the story is about Anne and Anders, this young man of the Borgen household, of one sect, in love with a girl, the daughter of the tailor, of a different sect. They can't marry because of the sectarian differences. So Inger, a immensely sympathetic figure, is doing everything she can to win over the patriarch of the family to make this marriage possible. The whole story turns upon this sort of local color situation of making a marriage possible against the peculiarities of the religious habits of the people. We are being led to believe all along that these religious habits are meaningless, that they are simply vestiges of a very dim past, that we want Anne and Anders to be happy. It's a love story. And so the film propels itself until suddenly this complication occurs with her birth. And at this point we see this dreadful image of the episiotomy followed by the severing of the baby's body. And in case we missed it, when the old father comes in, he says, the child, was it a boy? The son says, go look for yourself. It's in 4 pieces in the pail. A dreadful line. But the doctor apparently saves her. And everybody is happy, and she will live, and the doctor goes off. At this point, the film begins to shift. And the true central character of the film begins to emerge in his clarity, who is Johannes, the mad brother. It's the film, really, of Johannes's relationship with Inger, not the story of the two young people who are the foil for it, who would lead us into making this film more conventional than it is. But that's Dreyer's intent all along, to put us in the mood of a realistic film, to give us all of the tools of realism for dealing with the situation, all of the conviction of Johannes's madness. And here we'll see Johannes, when everyone else is happy that Inger has survived, Johannes enters the scene. Difference. This is one of the sequences where Johannes's preeminence begins to assert itself. And it's asserted cinematically by the most dramatic camera movement of the entire film. In fact, it seems as though Dreyer must have had to build a platform in which he could put both Johannes and the child Maren and the camera, because they remain in the same relationship to the camera, although the entire sequence makes at least a 360-degree turn around the room. Now, this centrality in the middle of a circle is amazing. I mean, the effect is very powerful. That is, there's no way in our normal relationship of camera to space for a camera to circle around two people and have the room spin and have the people not change in relationship to it. This radical divorce of the center of attention from the space around them is inscribed in this particularly crucial scene where Johannes is telling the child of the advantages of having a mother in heaven as opposed to one on earth. But she says, yeah, but I'd rather have one here. And he says, okay. And this incredibly touching line, she says, will you tuck me in? He says, not only that, I'll give you one of my father's angels to look after you. And of course, all along we've been led to believe that Johannes is nuts. But even in this scene, Dreyer begins to inscribe that sense of difference, that is, that somehow the camera is with Johannes and Maren, and not with the room. There are the characters of the room and the characters of the space, Borgen, who owns that space, who move and choreograph within it and who respond to the space of that room, and then Johannes is responding differently. But this is the first point at which the camera is clearly with Johannes. And now comes then, I hope, the moment at which the doctor is just departing and the minister's gone off and everyone is happy that Inger has survived and Johannes enters. In the entire film in which the camera does not move, that final shot of the dead Inger, where the stillness of the camera is related to the concept of death. But Johannes had entered. They were happy. He entered, and he says, the man with the scythe is here, the man with the scythe. He says, look! And you see the light on the wall. And it says, no, that's the doctor's car going away. And then the light, he says, but it's going through the wall. He said, go to bed. Then he hears the car starting, and he says, I hear him, he's cutting her. He says, no, that's the motor, go to bed. Go to bed. And we are led to be fools, like Anders and his father. We have been so seduced in this film as to take the image literally. And when Johannes names it for what it is, light, the projector beam, light, this is a configuration of light and sound. We say, no, it's the doctor's car. Go to bed, you nut. And then suddenly, out comes Mikkel, who says she's dead. And within the structure of this film, it's so convincing that it's hard to still be convinced of Johannes, because Dreyer is doing everything he can to show us our deep commitment to non-figurative reading. And at that point, another of the dreadful lines occurs. Anders Young says, well, I'm going to call a doctor. And he says, Mikkel says, if you can cure death, then go call him. Now, I'm taking you to the very end of the film. Johannes has disappeared. They think he's dead. He suddenly returns. Notice the way the montage style shifts suddenly for this spectacular scene. I've always been grateful for that musical coda. It gives one a chance to get rid of the tears. So here, after having made a film in which the camera is constantly weaving and renewing, suddenly, Dreyer slams on the brake. We find ourselves in the classical montage situation. The minister and the doctor are looking to one side. The tailor and Borgen are in another direction. Most important, little Marin is next to him. For the first time in the film, he cuts from a medium shot to a close-up of the little girl, back to a medium shot to a close-up, back to the coffin. That Dreyer has done an incredible cinematic historical miracle, that he has taken the most banal form of cinematic construction, the simple shot, counter-shot, dramatic montage construction, and having so subtly denied it to us for so long, having made a film in which we've come not to expect it, not even consciously, having so built into our expectations the realistic factor, a tremendous realistic touch, an anti-dramatic touch, which has all the more drama, is that moment when Borgen begins to go in to look at the dead Inger, and what do you hear? You hear his cows crying out. They have to be fed that morning. That's surely the Dreyer touch in that particular moment, to reinforce the brutal realism all the way through. Having had that realism tied to this sinuous movement of the reframing camera, continuing from, suddenly the brake is put on, suddenly we are in a mode of classical cinema with this incredible luminous light coming in from behind, and Dreyer gives us the most miraculous scene, both stylistically and in terms of content, that the cinema has ever produced. He brings us in this narrative, and for him, Dreyer's narrative is the way to fully establish the moment of death, or the threshold of death, to bring cinema to some realm of visibility at which it can figure and figure out something about death. At the same time, in this particular film, he returns us to the classic structures of the film at the very end, to renew them, and ultimately to endow them with more power than they ever had in the first place. Oh, it's late. That's it. Please feel free to leave. But if anybody wants to stay and ask any questions, I guess I could try to answer them. But don't feel like, you can also leave. It's late. Are there any questions? Okay. See you all tomorrow.